Today we're going to deal with a writer that I have written on in the past, and it's a chapter, an essay in my book on the history of Russian literature. And we're going to deal today with Anton Chekhov. Chekhov is almost completely unread by Orthodox people. I think that's a mistake. Chekhov is often very difficult to interpret. Most of his work is short stories, and he has many of these. And many commentators don't see that he has any kind of overarching system, any kind of overarching approach to reality. I don't agree with that. I think, at least dealing with some of his major pieces, that he does have an overarching system. It is not an ideology in the sense we normally use the term, but he is philosophically very interesting, and in my opinion, an equal to Gogol as far as Russian literature is concerned. He is a physician. He actually has an MD, although he normally doesn't practice. He dies at a very young age, at the age of 44 in 1904, and he deals sometimes with medical themes, often medical themes having to do with mental illness, and that is the topic of today. Chekhov and mental illness in two extremely important works. One of my favorite stories in later Russian literature, Ward Number 6, and then a shorter story, A Nervous Breakdown. Both of those give some indication that Chekhov is someone who attacks the modern Western Anglo-American view of progress and rejects the idea that the modern state, the modern industrial apparatus, as it has promised many, many years ago, to provide a world without want, without fear. And of course, that is completely and absolutely false. That the state and the modern industrial apparatus, whether it be in capitalist or socialist or some other ideological approach to society, has failed in even maintaining a reasonable modicum of freedom and justice. And in fact, these things have sacrificed many millions of people without any clear benefit in terms of making people happy, more secure, and more just. And so he sees progress, and in fact, he sees the modern state. I'm going to put this out as one of the central elements of Chekhov's thought, as far as I know, has never been put quite like this before, that Chekhov sees the modern state, the modern industrial world, as a constant attempt to regularize everything. Our relations, how we work with each other, within the economy, within the state, and then all of that, above all of that, how we relate to our own minds, and what industry and the modern state have done to the modern sense of self. And that's why Chekhov's work revolves around, like Dostoevsky, like Gogol, how man has psychologically adapted to modernity. We're talking the end of the 19th century, and we always have to remember that the elite at the time, especially in Western Europe, was claiming that modern ideas of state, bureaucracy, taxation, the economic ideas of increasing industrialization, that this was going to eliminate arbitrariness, this was going to bring mankind to a totally new plateau of development. We'll be happy, we'll be free, we will want for nothing, and because of all of the labor-saving devices that were being developed, and that are still being developed today, that human beings will work much less than they had to in the bad old days of the Middle Ages. Chekhov's work then, I'm going to say, at least in these major psychological works, is based on the concept that arbitrariness has not been removed, that man is as unhappy as he's ever been, and in fact that industry and the modern state have created so many stresses in society that man's psychology has not been able to adapt, that the development of industry has not been one of progress in any kind of moral sense, and certainly not in any kind of psychological sense. So the concept is, we live in an age where mental illness is a huge industry, and the drug manufacturers, and there's thousands of psychiatrists and counselors, and yet there's no evidence whatsoever that the average person today is more mentally healthy than he was in Chekhov's time. This is the problem. Dostoevsky deals with this problem constantly, and this has become the central area of Chekhov's point of view. So I want to say that Chekhov, in the most general term, is anti-modernist and holds that those specific aspects of modern life, such as the modern state, individualism, rights as something granted by the state, the sort of labor, the sort of economic life that we live within an industrial, computerized society, that these have absolutely failed to live up to their promises. These things have been imposed on society, and that although certain things coming from industry and mechanized agriculture have clearly benefited people, that from a psychological point of view, people are increasingly worse off. People are working more. People have not successfully adapted to modernity, even with all the generations of humanity who've been forced to live under it. And the human mind and the human psyche cannot function in a world and in a society that is based on the machine in one form or another. I mean, literally machines that we work on every day of our lives, and machines in the sense that they have come to organize how we think and how we act. That's the concept of Chekhov's work, especially in these two areas, and that modernity has destroyed our psyche. It's destroyed our psyche in many ways, but the broken promises of modernity is the one thing that we can see very clearly in the massive increase in mental illness and depression and extreme anxiety over the last 100 years, and how these things are very tightly related to the extremely fast-paced world of industrial society, a world that the human brain was not designed to tolerate, that cannot tolerate. The human brain is designed to live in a basically agrarian life, but the high speed of modern existence has taxed the human mind and has forced it to think and act much quicker and over a long period of time than ever before. And these things have led to mental illness, severe anxiety, depression, chemical issues, and everything else. The modernity has created these institutions that have forced the mind to do things and to act in ways that are not natural to it. Okay, I want to start with ward number 6. Ward number 6 is one of the most disturbing pieces of literature that have ever been written, certainly one of the most disturbing in Russian history. It is purely realistic in that he's dealing with the day-to-day functions of a mental hospital and the condition that it's in and the nature of the inmates, of which there are very few. There's this whole, mental illness genre, like A Girl Interrupted or A Beautiful Mind, these kind of things. And, the mental institution really is an allegory for the society as a whole. In ward number 6, the inmates, as well as the caretaker, these are victims of modern society and the fact that it has not been able to eliminate the kind of random, chaotic aspects of life. Almost all the inmates in ward number 6 are where they are because they have not been able to deal with the chaotic and arbitrary nature of society, especially a society that was supposed to be, because it was slowly modernizing. Russia at the end of the 19th century was modernizing rapidly. This may have created a whole new class of millionaires. It did not make the average city dweller or the average peasant any happier than he was 100 years before. The caretaker, or the warden really, of the number 6 ward is Nikita, who is extremely violent. He cares really only about order and regularity, and he really isn't picky about how that is imposed on the ward. He views the inmates as savages. He is representative of a certain kind of state that wants to impose a violent order upon a society and upon a society that threatens it. The worst thing for this kind of bureaucratic mentality is for chaos to remain unchecked. Chekhov is consistently saying that no matter how violent the caretaker is, the chaotic world and its constant intrusion onto modern societies is going to continue, and in many ways has gotten worse. The inmates of Ward number 6 are from all different classes. There's a Jew named Moisieka who owned a hat factory that was destroyed in a fire. And that destruction of his livelihood based on industrial production of hats and, of course, the marketing network that he was a part of, and it wasn't as if he went out of business or lost to his competition. The place was destroyed in a fire. Again, one of these arbitrary events, very hard to guard against, and who knows, no one says how it started or anything else, but it's a random event that destroyed his livelihood. He was doing well prior to this, and his hat factory burned down, and he went crazy because he saw his entire life's work destroyed. But he also went crazy because he is the archetypal businessman. He sees success and failure existing only in dollars and cents. And so because he saw the source of those dollars and cents go up in flames, he went crazy. But he's one of the nuts in Ward number 6 that's actually friendly and pleasant. He wants to help people. He makes the new inmates feel at home. Because of this, he's given more freedom than everybody else. He kind of come and go as he pleases. He never causes trouble. And he tries to be as helpful as he can. Ivan Gromov is a 33-year-old man. He is described as having a mania of persecution. Like Moisieka, his livelihood and family were destroyed by really a random misfortune. Illness, physical illness, and a lot of problems that come from that destroyed much of his life. His character is very much a Westerner, and he is somebody who has dabbled in middle-class life, found this Western middle-class life is very unstable. He has this black and white method of thinking about the world, but the big problem with Gromov is that he's petrified of the state. This comes up quite often. Governments, even if they're constitutional, even if they have a rationalized judiciary, he's afraid that he is going to be mistakenly arrested, that he'll get arrested and convicted of a crime that someone else committed, that there'll be a mix-up in the paperwork, and he'll end up going to prison. This whole concept of this ward, this mental ward representing society, is that these people put their faith in things like capitalism, middle-class life, Western technology, but the pain, the unhappiness, the chaos, it still exists. It may take different forms, but it still exists. Ward number 6 is about bureaucracy destroying humanity. The paranoia of Ivan Gromov is based on this concept that the state is powerful, the bureaucracies are immensely powerful and large. It's all really based on paperwork. And so all it would take is just a simple mix-up in my file, and I could be accidentally arrested for something. If the wrong piece of paper gets into the wrong file, I could be arrested. I could go to prison. I could go to Siberia. I could be executed. And his life falls apart because he can't stop obsessing that all it would take is one small clerical error and he could be destroyed. Anyone could be destroyed. These things, these institutions are so large and powerful, and they function according to their own interests. It's just a routine to them. And people coming in and coming out trying to get help and assistance, they're just background noise. Fact is that the modern state is of such immense power, but it's based on this brittle institution of the basic bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is strictly a modern creation. But because of its power and its surveillance over people, and the fact that laws are written in such a way that really anyone could get arrested because of them, that there's so many laws that the average person can't possibly know them all, and they can accidentally do something that can get them into a lot of trouble. This is what Gromov goes through. He sees bureaucracy as taking chaos to the next level, even though the purpose of bureaucracy is for it to take social life and make it more regular and normal. So Gromov goes insane. He becomes paranoid in the clinical sense of the word. But then he also makes it clear, and Chekhov makes it clear everywhere, that mental illness is social. Mental illness is not chemical, in his medical opinion. It is social. It's social because society promises one thing and then gives another. Society promises to make life predictable and normal and based on law and publicly promulgated methods, and yet this is window dressing. Anything could happen, and anything will happen. The only difference is that the modern state and economic system are so immensely powerful that the tiniest clerical error can destroy the lives of anybody. This kind of power can't be institutionalized. The whole thing is based on fraud. Chaos is worse than ever, and Gromov is one of these people. He's obsessed with the notion that no matter what I do with my life, using American terms, no matter what I do, I could be audited tomorrow, and it's all gone. I could be a wealthy man, and all it would take is one lawsuit from out of nowhere, and it could destroy me. Anything could happen. The rule of law has just made it possible for any judge to figure out some way to take anybody and convict them of something. The laws are so immense and cover every aspect of life that there's probably no day that goes by that we don't break some law or other unwillingly. Now, the doctor in charge of the place is Andrei Rogin, who is a meek doctor. He is a former seminarian. He sees the medical establishment in this region as very corrupt. People simply don't care. And the people in Ward number 6 are totally forgotten. People hardly even know who they are. He had too many patients. He was assigned to this region, and there's simply so many problems, physical and mental, that he can't keep up with them all. He is a man of a very meek temperament. He loves reading and study, but he does this really more as a pastime than anything else. Now, the concept of this chaos is pursued consistently. Dr. Rogin, for example, comes to the conclusion that it's only these random circumstances in our life that separates the sane from the insane. That had, for example, Mozieka, the hat factory owner, had some tiny little circumstance not developed somewhere in the life of that factory, the fire would not have destroyed it. The tiny event that will eventually, over time, cause effect, lead to this factory burning down. It could be the tiniest little event that, had it not happened, that causal chain that led to the destruction of the factory would never have occurred. And this is a constant drumbeat here. And now the doctor, who is assigned to Ward number 6 and the hospital in general, sees people simply, they do not care. The bureaucracy is corrupt. People from Ward number 6 are just considered, they're just crazy. There's nothing you could do with them. But he comes to the conclusion that all of these people at one point were perfectly sane. But something happened. Something hit them. Something blindsided them. And everything changed. The only thing that separates the sane from the insane are these random causal chains that nothing really can prevent. You could take all of the precautions against these kind of things you want. You never know what very small circumstance could eventually mushroom into your complete destruction. And you never know. And the modern state, modern industry, modern legal profession, they do not protect you from it. In fact, they give more opportunity for this sort of thing to happen. So, Rogin becomes a philosopher of sorts, and he begins to study Stoicism. Now, I spent a lot of time on Stoicism some years ago, but it's really the quasi-official point of view of the Roman ruling class during the development of the empire. Part of the idea of Stoicism is that you accept suffering and pain because it is a completely unavoidable part of life. You don't try to justify it, but you treat pain to be no different than pleasure, totally out of your control. You do your duty during the course of a day, and whatever happens, happens. The events that happen to you are not the problem. How you conceive of the events, that is the problem. And Dr. Ragin will go into a speech where he talks about the only way to happiness, given the chaos of modern life, is complete stoic indifference. We know that the state can act in the most arbitrary of ways, no matter how the Constitution is written. The bureaucracy can, for whatever reason, find you guilty of a crime that you didn't even know existed. The amount of paperwork means that really anything could happen. Any mix-up can land you in prison for doing absolutely nothing because your chart got mixed up with somebody else's. These are minor circumstances, and he knows that modernity has not solved these things, and hence the only possible reaction is stoic indifference. Okay, let's take a break here. We'll continue with Chekhov when we return. Okay, everybody, welcome back to The Orthodox Nationalist. We're dealing today with Anton Chekhov, Russian writer and playwright at the end of the 19th century. And we're dealing with his approach to the modern state and industrial world and its relation to mental illness, one of Chekhov's favorite topics. As I said before, he is a medical doctor, and so he is approaching medicine and insanity and things like that with some kind of clinical ability. Dr. Ragin develops this concept that we just have to give up the idea, the modern scientific idea, that all aspects of our social life can be controlled and made regular. Rather than chaos, we have rules. And Ragin says that we know that that's not true. We know that that can't happen. If anything, the errors of a large bureaucracy are infinitely more obnoxious than the errors of a private person. And he even develops this concept of spending money to take care of people who are very, very sick starts not making any sense to him. Everyone's going to die. Everyone's going to suffer. So why would we spend resources stopping things that we know we can't stop? Especially in people of Ward number 6. No one really knew that much about mental illness back then, and so people just got put away. And no one does spend any time with them. They don't take medicine or anything. They don't even bathe. They're just in a prison that's called a hospital. Well, why would we even permit that? And we never know what circumstances are going to cause the destruction of our psyche. The tiniest little thing that gets blown out of proportion and we're finished. This is the shocking element. And Ragin's saying that we should be indifferent and just not worry about events. Keep internal control and peace, and that's it. And there are people, Ivan Gromov, for example, who we've talked about before, this whole legal arbitrary concept, attacks the idea of this stoic indifference. Says no one can really live this way. No one could possibly simply ignore negative events and claim that they're part of the historical process, though they're inevitable and whatever. The notion of the human person, the notion of the human organism, is that the more advanced the human psyche becomes, the more it's capable of dealing with and ordering its feelings and emotions. Only rich people can take the stoic point of view. Life is these positive and negative feelings, not this very eccentric concept of stoic indifference and that kind of philosophy, that fatalism that Ragin begins to preach once he realizes that he can't stop not only the corruption of the hospital and the town and politicians, but why even try when we know that anything can happen to us? Anything can and will happen to us. And the more powerful the state or the economy becomes, the more authority it has over people, the greater the chance of these kind of chaotic occurrences based on nothing other than some random event that could lead a perfectly normal person to become a perfectly abnormal person. And he begins to even wonder the very nature of sanity or insanity. Who decides what is sane or insane? It's usually some power center, some center of medical authority that is close to the establishment that decides what behaviors are normal and what behaviors are not. That people like Gromov get committed for this paranoia, and yet he is quite capable of justifying that this paranoia is not clinical. It happens all the time. The conclusion of Ward number 6 is that Dr. Ragin begins to have these regular philosophical discussions with the members of the ward, the inmates of the ward. He becomes very close to them, not really personally, but intellectually. He begins to start taking the ideas of Gromov seriously. And really the conclusion is that Ragin, because of his behavior, himself will become an inmate in ward number 6. And he becomes an inmate largely because he is regularly involved in serious philosophical conversation with these people who everyone says are crazy. Everything is arbitrary. He came in, he attempted to do the right thing, but his reaction to the corruption and the evil of that particular society led him to be considered abnormal by his colleagues. A social life is a random set of interactions. There is no specific good that it promotes, because there's no way of knowing whether or not that ideology just serves the ruling class or it really is representative of the population. Ward number 6 is what happens when people are bureaucratically organized based on their behavioral traits. Some things are considered normal, some things are not. But the power that decides that is exactly the same power as modern government and modern industry that sets a completely different set of standards as to what is crazy and what is not. Gromov, living as if in fear of the bureaucracy, is enough to get him committed. So as it turns out, he was right. Chekhov himself even says, if you were to take just what you need, your food, your shelter, very basic needs, you would end up working like 2 hours a day. People are working, no matter how many labor-saving devices get invented, they're working more, and they're working more to produce luxuries, things that no one needs, but that the system has decided that they want. So this becomes the main reason that I can conclude that Chekhov is aiming his guns at the modern mind. The modern mind coming out of the High Middle Ages is the creation of an industrial, statist complex that will eliminate this kind of uncertainty and provide plenty and peace and justice for everybody. This is what modernity is based on. This is what the Enlightenment is based on. And in Chekhov's mind, it has not succeeded. What it's done instead is concentrating more power so that the error of government authority 1,000 years ago is magnified 100 times by an error in a governing authority today. The point is that chaos has not been overcome. It's simply been shifted. Its focus has been shifted. That the modern mind did not succeed, and in fact succeeded, at least in the case of ward number 6, simply creating a set of concepts convenient to it of what is considered acceptable and what is not. And so a society, an ignorant provincial society, and Chekhov's this town that it's going on, there's really no education, there is no scholarship. Any intellectual is really bored there, and this doctor has been assigned there and eventually gets committed into his own institution because of his philosophical temper. He and Gromov are criticizing the regime. They're criticizing the nature of modernity. They argue and debate. The warden, Nikita, the town elders, how is this man talking like this? You know, he's dangerous. He's a problem. He goes against the grain. He makes us feel uncomfortable. And so he then becomes an inmate in ward number 6. Okay, that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of ward number 6. It is not that long, but it is saturated with a very serious philosophical criticism that often gets ignored because, Chekhov has this reputation of being this modern liberal, and the more you read his criticism of social institutions that are associated with sort of Westernism and liberalism and everything else, it becomes problematic. Now, we have a similar situation in a much shorter story. It came out in 1888 called A Nervous Breakdown. This is an immensely significant work. It does not get the treatment that it deserves, but again, it is about mental illness and about how the human mind has adapted to the modern order. The main character is Vasilev, who is a medical student, who has a number of friends that enjoy going out, drinking heavy, and visiting prostitutes. Prostitution is something that was illicit but tolerated on the fringes of Russian urban life. Vasilev is a character that's familiar. Readers of Chekhov, he's sort of an ordinary, prosaic type, not particularly interesting, just sort of one of these mediocre mass men that show up not only in Chekhov but also in Dostoevsky and in Gogol. Sort of an ordinary person. Now here the plot is extremely simple. If you guys know the first half of Gogol's Nevsky Prospect, it's a very similar problem. This man is a little sheltered. Vasilev is a medical student. He's sheltered. His friends, however, are certainly more liberated and actually have a habit of going to the red light district and visiting these houses of prostitution. It's kind of a normal way of life for them. Vasilev has never been here before. Doesn't really, it's one of these, the underbelly of society, very inconvenient. No one really likes talking about them. But, of course, these are fairly well-off institutions. In other words, many respectable men are visiting. You see this in the paintings of Degas, for example, and in his approach to prostitution. Gogol deals with it in Nevsky Prospect, the first half of it. Something that is idealized. So much of Dostoevsky's work, for example, even Turgenev, the young innocent girl is almost always associated with old Russia, a Russia of the church and the commune, not the Russia of the urban life and the factory. He comes across a girl, maybe 17, seemingly perfectly resigned in a stoic way to her fate. Vasilev starts on a path to complete mental breakdown because of it. He sees a girl that you should figure under normal circumstances would be intelligent, would be very attractive, would have her pick of men, and yet something happened. One of these random events, someone got killed, someone got sick, a fire destroyed your livelihood, whatever it is, and now this girl has no choice but to work as a prostitute. They have adapted to their life. One of the things that drives Vasilev crazy is that these girls don't seem to have any problem with what they're doing. Their makeup is really artificial. I mean, this is like caked on. They're trained to talk in very, very intense sexual terms, which coming out of a teenage girl, just especially at the time, kind of blows him away. He doesn't really do anything. And what he begins to do is, in this slow move to insanity, he starts preaching to these girls. This is not how you're supposed to live. These men are outrageous coming here. He confronts his friends. Why did you bring me here? These girls are children. What happened to them that they're here? It's always some random event. They weren't born like this. A lot of these girls, a father abandoned them, someone dies. It's always this random event. Vasilev looks at these girls. He sees them as like animals. They have been reduced to simply performing these animal acts because there is nothing more that they can do. They were slaves. They had no rights. For them, it was just a job. I didn't have much of a choice, so this is probably as good of a gig as is working in a factory. And they seem to have had no moral sense of what they were doing, especially since they probably didn't have a whole lot of choice in the matter. His path to insanity, which, in Chekhov's world, he's heading for ward number 6, is this concept that this is intolerable. The fact that people tolerate it then puts a tremendous amount of pressure on me. Here's the problem. Vasilev will eventually collapse completely. And he'll do it because he sees such a clear moral problem. It's not just prostitution, but it's the social system in urban life that permits this to happen. The fact that very powerful bureaucrats visit these houses of prostitution and so probably protect them. Technically, these were not permitted, of course, under Orthodox teaching and Russian law, and yet because enough powerful people were visiting them, they were protected from any kind of prosecution. Here's the problem. Vasilev sees a moral problem and a social context that then drives him crazy. he's driven crazy for this particular reason. He says, I'm a rational, intelligent human being. I am a medical student. I'm a scientist. I have a particular responsibility to preach to these women, to preach to the men who go in and out of these houses, to the madam, even to the girls themselves in a certain way, to stop this practice and to stop the moral concept found in modern urban life that permits it. But there's a couple of problems. Number one, he can't penetrate that lustful desire that powerful people have. Number two, he's all by himself. In this part of the world, he's really the only one. And he's wondering, how can I be the only one that has a problem with the existence of these things and these poor, rundown areas of urban Russia? It's clearly a mission that he has to be on, that he is forced to be on by the very virtue of his rationality, but he can't change anything. He will collapse. He will have a total nervous breakdown because there's this disconnect, this alienation. He knows the truth. He can rationally justify. I mean, he's looking at slavery right in front of his face. Otherwise, intelligent men are going to these things and partaking of this. Everyone knows that it's wrong, but it satisfies that drive, and so it will be justified and tolerated. But that means in his mind that the entire moral struggle, therefore, is totally on his shoulders. So here's the problem. Number one, he has a clear and distinct moral duty to do battle against this stuff. But number two, he knows that he's all by himself and that he can't have any impact on it. That problem drives him crazy. That problem will eventually lead him to a complete nervous breakdown because he is failing to deal with this conceptual conflict between duty on the one hand and the impossibility of carrying out the objectively real duty on the other. This is a problem. Okay, now we've briefly dealt with the philosophical content of word number 6 and have briefly dealt with the philosophical content of a nervous breakdown. What are we talking about here? Chekhov wanted more than anything else to expose the absurdity of modern life. He wanted them to examine these institutions and these structures. He wanted to take an abstract philosophical conception and make it real and empirical with these characters. Human will is always the problem. God's world is good, but the human will destroy it. Honesty is one of the biggest problems. People claim to want honesty, but when you are actually honest, you make enemies very, very fast. Progress has been able to justify things that under different circumstances could never have been justified. Progress has produced as many negative things as positive things. One of the greatest moral problems of humanity is lethargy. And lethargy is this notion that if you're part of a bureaucracy or some social machine, you follow your job description and that's it. Anything over and above that is simply too much work. This is a problem. This is why somebody like Rugin could end up in the word number 6, or how someone like Vasilev can go crazy. The constant theme that shows up is arbitrariness. The fact that chaos rules, that the causes for social events, good, bad, or indifferent, are so complicated that there is simply no way to trace it all, which means we ultimately don't know what causes the things that occur. That if you are born a normal, intelligent child, there is no guarantee that no matter how successful you become, that everything won't be destroyed by the time you are of middle age. And yet this kind of rationalization was meant to be, this was the promise of modern life. And no matter how the machine develops, no matter how the state develops, no matter how concepts of right or constitutionalism develop, we are all absolutely slaves of circumstance. He saw the discipline of medicine, which he knew very well, to be really no different from how modern politicians justify themselves. They are fixing a sick society. they are using different kinds of policy medication to destroy certain problems. It's the same thing. The only problem is that there is absolutely no way to understand the different causal chains that lead to different circumstances. And like the postmodern schools could develop later on, the idea is that power and control and tyranny isn't necessarily something that derives from centralized institutions. Control and tyranny could exist in our psyche. It exists in our own individual life. And what the individual has to do is try to take apart the different structures and institutions that they deal with every day of their lives and then expose where the authoritarian tyrannical power lies. The fact is that when you go to a psychiatrist and talk to them about your problems, you are taking the exact same tone as when you go in front of a judge asking for assistance, telling them the circumstances of your life, or you go to a confessor and you talk to him about the various problems of your life. These institutions are all the same, no matter how they've been rationalized over the years. The rationalization really is a way, an ideological way, to paper over the tyranny that always exists. The very existence of these institutions implies and assumes a laundry list of small, minor, tyrannical powers that over time can destroy your ability to think straight. And the conclusion, really, in terms of a nervous breakdown, is that being honest and finding the truth turned out to be the biggest disasters that you can ever deal with. Being honest means that you may end up being sent to an institution, as Ragin did. To use philosophy to criticize the system as it is can get you declared insane. I've said this before, that I'm seeing in American debate that there's not a debate that I've been able to read or hear that there isn't some accusation that your opponent is mentally ill. They're paranoid, they're schizophrenic. These are common accusations. So how can you believe that? You're crazy. That all of these things have a tendency to go straight to the psyche. To discover the truth is to live alone. To be honest is to be hated. If you honestly confront people with the absurdity of their lives, the absurdity of the system that they work for, if you keep it up, you'll be called a troublemaker, but it's not very far from being called a troublemaker to being institutionalized. And there's no way that Chekhov could have known this, but what he is writing, especially in Ward number 6, will eventually become reality under Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was the one that really kind of redoubled Soviet efforts to take political criminals as insane, not as simply wrong, but because no normal person can oppose the utopia of the working man, then he must be crazy to oppose it, and so he should be sent to a mental institution. But of course, we all know that there is no difference between a mental institution and a prison. The inmates of Ward number 6 are treated as if they're criminals. There is no medical care. There's nothing. In fact, even the building is simply decaying from neglect. That there is no moral distinction between, Ragin on the one hand, who works very hard, at least initially, with his patients, and simply ignoring his patients. You could always justify it. Reason can justify anything. So Ragin eventually finds himself saying, well, then what difference does it make? If I could make a moral case that those who are sick should be destroyed, I could also make a moral case that those who are sick should be taken care of. Since I could make an equally powerful moral case in both areas, there is no reason whatsoever that I should follow one or the other. The conclusion, then, is that I should follow whatever is easy for me. That's exactly what the town elders in that place had done. That's exactly what these boys going to the brothel in a nervous breakdown, it was the same thing. Their mentality is one of intellectual laziness, and the constant existence of modern relativism means that you don't have to follow anything but your own will. That's the only thing that's real. The fact that someone like Dr. Reagan can make an argument that treating patients makes no sense. Treating patients wastes social capital. We should be worrying about the healthy people, not the sick people, and certainly not people in ward number 6 who are never going to leave there. If a patient dies too young, well, what is an extra 10 years? Especially since you have no idea that following 10 years if something awful isn't going to happen to you, and you should have died years ago. Dr. Regin continues this line of argument that I can justify not treating patients at all. I could justify treating patients until I'm completely overworked. He starts talking about the Stoicism. He starts engaging the patients in ward number 6 to the point where he is then sentenced there as well. Fact is that he was honest. And from a secular, empirical point of view, he stumbled upon one problem. Corruption is justified because there's nowhere to stand for you to condemn them for being corrupt. You probably have done as many bad things as they have, but since you don't have a public position, then people might not notice. Why should somebody with a public position be held to a higher standard than someone like a doctor? Especially since I, as an educated man, can justify simply not treating patients because I'm wasting resources and these people are sick and so they shouldn't reproduce. We want to have a healthy society. So treating these crazy people is just a waste of money. But when he comes in and he challenges this idea, he will then also be sent to the institution. There is some truth what people say that Chekhov did not have an overarching system. But what I've tried to do here in the last 50 minutes is give a sense that Chekhov is an antecedent mind to the postmodernist concept. That Chekhov is talking about this perpetual relativity given the mentality of modern industrialism. That utility really is the only moral basis. And if utility is the only moral basis, then society should function around assisting its harder working, healthy people. Because these are the people who produce value. These are the people that therefore produce happiness and satisfaction. And he finds himself going down the same path to insanity, Regin does, as Vasilev will do in A Nervous Breakdown. Both of these men start off with this tremendous honesty, a level of scrupulosity that the average person does not have. Both Vasilev and Regin have this mentality. The problem is coming to the truth, especially when you're all alone. And Regin and Vasilev are also both all alone. They have found the truth of the matter, but in finding it has given them nothing but pain. They are both impotent in dealing with this problem. Not only impotent, but both of these men find that their honesty has caused them nothing but trouble. And at least Regin tries to talk himself out of it, because he is overworked at first, and saying, well, so what? Let's say all my patients died tomorrow. Well, they were probably going to die in a few years anyway. And I don't know if my cures are helping them or not. Everyone has a different reaction to these chemicals. Who knows? So the utilitarian argument would say, you know what, let's focus on healthy, productive people, and let's not worry about all of these moral problems. And eventually Regin will be sent to the institution. Vasilev himself will also go crazy. This is the problem. This is the problem of truth and honesty in a fallen, demonic world. This is the nature of the problem. This is why Chekhov wrote what he wrote. And this is why you can say, at least in general terms, that Chekhov had this anti-modernist, anti-statist, even to some extent an anti-industrial concept. Because of the promises of these institutions, none of which ever actually developed properly. Okay, that is my talk for tonight. I appreciate everybody who has donated to my work here. That money always goes to things that are very closely connected to either my church life or my research here. And you guys have been very generous, and I really appreciate it. And I want to thank you publicly for that, and I thank you for listening. Okay, bye-bye.